Good evening, everyone. It's your girl, Marcie Thomas, and I'm here with you this evening for a special episode of Live Well Sister. So please come on in the room as we prepare to dive into a very important conversation on a day that has been difficult for many of us as we consider what has recently happened politically, if you're watching this in real time or within the next few days. So, I'm feeling a lot of feels, and we can get into that here in a few moments, as I'm sure many of you are as well. But if you haven't watched before, again, I'm Marcie Thomas, founder of Brown Girl Collective and host of Live Well Sister, where we really come together to have important conversations about the things that help us to live our best lives. And this particular conversation about reproductive justice is one of those things as well. So tonight, I am pleased to have with us Renee Bracey Sherman, who is a reproductive justice activist, abortion storyteller, and writer. She is the founder and executive director of We Testify, an organization dedicated to the leadership and representation of people who have abortions and share their stories at the intersection of race, class, and gender identity. She is also an executive producer of Ours to Tell, an award-winning documentary elevating the voices of people who've had abortions, co-host of The A-Files, A Secret History of Abortion, a podcast from The Meteor, and co-author of this book that we're going to dive into this evening, along with some other conversations. This is Liberating Abortion, Claiming Our History, Sharing Our Stories, and Building the Reproductive Future We Deserve, which she wrote along with Regina Mahone. So without any further delay, let's welcome Renee to Live Well Sister.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Yes, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate you taking out the time out of your busy schedule with so many things going on. And I'm sure, as I've mentioned, where we are, a lot of us are, and how we're feeling today, that you're probably getting a lot of folks wanting to get your take on what's happening. So first of all, right, exactly. And when we planned this a few weeks ago, who knew, right, that we would be here on this day. So based upon what happened with VP Harris not getting the being able to win the election, how are you feeling, or how is this shaping up for you today?
I'm feeling a lot of things. I'm a little numb because it is bittersweet. We're both celebrating in the States that a lot of the ballot initiatives for abortion access won. Even the ones like in Florida where it didn't win because it didn't hit the 60% threshold, right. Still 58% of the vote. So it was very clear that people do support abortion access across this country and want to make sure that people are able to have safe and legal abortion everywhere. And yet this country is so deeply racist and xenophobic and anti-Black and colonialist, and all of those things to then send Donald Trump back to the White House. I think that, it's quite terrifying, and it can be a little misaligned, because why would people vote for abortion in their state, but then vote for a president who vowed to overturn Roe v. Wade and worked really hard to ban abortion across this country? And I really think it's because they believe his lies that he was returning it to the States. They're also deeply motivated by anti-Blackness and xenophobia, anti-immigrant sentiments, just really a lot of racism. And we need to have a real conversation about that in this country.
We definitely do. And I'm, in spite of the fact that I as well am unhappy about the results, at the same time, I'm not really shocked
Right.
because this is America. And I also feel that, as we process what has happened, as we begin to think about what the future could potentially look like, and as we begin to, we have to go through this grief process. We just do.
Yeah.
That's important, not to try to tamp it down and think that we automatically have to jump to work. We need a few days, okay?
I mean, what is happening is terrifying because, I think I've heard people say, well, we lived through one Trump administration, we can live through another. No, actually, a lot of people didn't.
Right.
Do you guys remember COVID? There's stories all the time about people who died because they weren't able to get abortions because Roe was overturned. There are a lot of people, particularly Black and brown people, who did not live through the Trump administration. Trans folks were murdered. Immigrants murdered. Like separating families at the border. Like all of that is really terrifying. And so I think people do deserve the time to really sit and process what has happened, and also recognize that maybe some people that you're in community with or love or work with probably voted for him. And that is really scary. I've also seen people say, oh, how are you guys cutting off friends because of who they voted for? This isn't just like I think we should tax people a little differently. I mean, this is a fundamental difference in how people should be able to live in this country. And if you don't feel safe, that I think that is an absolutely valid option. You deserve to feel safe and loved in your workplace and with your family and with your friends. And so I think people are really coming to terms with that.
Yes. One of the things and then we can move on and start to talk more about your work and the book. One of the things that I've seen a lot of today is women who have children, either women or, birthing people who have had children saying, what do I say to my daughters? Or, wow, I'm glad I have sons and not daughters, because what would I say to my daughter today to help, for her to understand that, she lives in a place that doesn't really care about her. So what would you say to those people who may be struggling in that way? Or how are you even feeling in that regard?
I have some littles in my life that I texted their mother this morning, and we were in New York over the weekend, and we had talked about the Proposition 1 and the reproductive freedom protections that Proposition 1, which one in New York, was offering, and also the signs that were there against Proposition 1 that were using fear-mongering around transphobia and around trans girls in particular. And we talked about that. And I think when I talked with them over the weekend, we said, no matter what happens, we have work to do to make sure that all kids feel safe in schools, and that, we are a family that loves people, and we show up and make sure that all kids get to play sports, all kids get to have love, all kids get to decide, their futures and their bodies and who they are. And so I think we're just reminding children that this is a part of challenges, and this is how we keep organizing, and we keep talking to each other about what our values are. As I've been doing the book tour, I've heard a lot of people sort of say to me with the book, like, oh, I need to get this for my daughter. What do I say to my daughter? And I think that that's absolutely real. And also, what are you saying to your sons?
Right.
Because the number one group that voted for Donald Trump is men.
Right.
And so what are you saying to your sons? What are you saying to your husband? Like, stop letting them off the hook here. I think that's part of the larger problem around how we talk about reproductive health care and abortion, pregnancy, all of those things, is that it's something we talk to girls about, and we leave the trans kids out, and we definitely leave the cisgender boys out. Everybody needs to learn about their bodies and sex and consent and pregnancy and all of these things. It's not just one or the other. Talk to your sons too. How are they showing up to make a better world for girls and women and trans folks to live? They are half of this country as well. And I think it's really important that you talk to them about misogyny and how easy it is to get pulled into it. It's a conversation that we all need to have.
We all need to have it. And last thing I'm just going to say along that line, earlier today I had an opportunity to talk to like my best male friend, and he was pissed. And just the conversation that we were having, I was like, see, this is why I like you, because you are speaking things that make a lot of sense, that you have an understanding of these things. So that is important, that the men in our lives, and boys need to also be aware of what's going on. So before we get into the book itself, tell me a little bit about your journey and what led you to become a reproductive justice activist, because the book is new. You've been doing this work for quite a while.
I've been doing this work for almost 15 years now, which feels wild to say. I think the short answer is that I had an abortion when I was 19. And although I grew up in a pro-choice family, I still felt a lot of stigma towards, for having an abortion and being afraid to talk about it. And in particular, when I had my abortion, I sort of felt this caught in between the way in which society talks about teen parents, and in particular, teen parents of color, as this just denigrating them as they're what's wrong with society. But then also that, abortion was a bad choice. And I was like, I don't know I can't choose any of them. They both feel like the wrong. Right. And I knew I didn't want to be pregnant. I knew I didn't want to parent. So I chose an abortion. But when I started organizing with young people, I realized how isolated I felt in not being able to talk about the fact that I had an abortion, and not being able to talk about how race and other identities impacted that. So for me, as a biracial Black woman, I wanted to be able to talk about the difference between what the expectations and access looked like for white folks, white family, versus Black folks, my Black family. And so I started sharing my abortion story and wanting to talk about how intersectionality and race and class all impacted that. I ended up finding reproductive justice, which is this 30-year-old framework that is not just looking at the right to abortion, but also the right to have a child and the ability to have children and parent them in safe and sustainable communities, free from state-sanctioned violence and coercion. And it really forces us to talk about the history of reproductive coercion and violence in this country, and how it impacts what access looks like today. That, this is a nation born out of genocide of Native American folks and chattel slavery of Black and brown folks, and that Black folks' reproduction was literally for profit. And that was some of the early criminalization of abortion, was a fear that Black people would outnumber white people. And so they started restricting abortion because they wanted to make sure that white women, white people were able to have children and stay in power. Does that sound like what's happening today?
So that's why as I was reading, I'm like, wait a doggone minute.
That's the thing. History is a circle. It is just a circle. And I think what's important is that we have a better understanding of that our decisions about our reproduction, about having abortions, are not made in isolation. That it is They are decisions that are made alongside all of the context. To quote Kamala Harris, your coconut fell on a coconut tree. Like, you exist within the context of all that came before you. And that is so clear with reproductive justice. And so when I found it as a framework, then it became very clear to me of like, oh, I'm not just saying, oh, I don't want to be pregnant. It's also about how we treat young people who are parenting, young teens who are pregnant, Black and brown teens who are pregnant, all of those things at once. And actually, how do we remove the stigma towards all of us? So I started sharing my abortion story and met so many other folks who've had abortions. And then I learned the statistic that the majority of people who have abortions are people of color. And I felt like, where are we in this conversation? So I started with, I built my organization, We Testify, which works with folks who've had abortions, share their abortion stories, particularly at the intersection of race and class and gender identity, specifically working with folks of color to open up the conversation about abortion in our communities. And then over the last 5 years, my co-author, Regina Mahone, and I have been writing this book, Liberating Abortion, where we read a lot of books on the history of abortion, and if people of color were included, which most books they're not, but if they're included, it's sort of an afterthought. And we wanted to write a book that wrote ourselves back into history and thought about what were we doing and how were we having abortions before criminalization, before colonization, before white supremacy sort of changed how our ancestors were living. And also, what do we need to liberate abortion going forward? Which, as this election has proven, and is the thesis of our book, that you have to eradicate white supremacy and anti-Blackness, because that will always be a through line of control for people in this country.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, of course, I'm sure others have said it, but you have a certain amount of courage, bravery, chutzpah, all of these things stand up in this space that for many, there is a lot of stigma. There is a lot of, people will be pissed off about it. I'm sure there'll be people who won't watch this show because of what we're talking about, because of the stigma and all that. But just like a lot of other things in our communities, if we don't have the right types of conversations, how are we ever going to change things?
I would add that I think when I've had conversations with people about abortion, and I come to it from a reproductive justice perspective, it sounds a bit different to them. Or when they read the book, it sounds very different to them because they're so used to the conversation about abortion being like, don't have kids until you're ready and have an abortion and that's it. And what we're really trying to do in Liberating Abortion is bring forward and bring new eyes to the reproductive justice framework, which is saying, yes, you should have the right to not have a child, but also the right to have a child. Because in Black and brown communities, we know that people lose that, whether the state takes children through adoption, or the fact that infertility is actually very high in Black and brown communities. Folks don't have the money and resources to be able to parent their children, or people feel like they have to have an abortion simply because they can't afford another child. And I think what we're trying to say is that everyone, no matter how much money they do or do not have, deserves to be able to have the families that they want. And how do we build a world and communities in which we all get the love and support for our families? It's not just about not having a child. It's about also having children and building families, queer families, single families, young families, all of those things. How do we show up? And we believe that if we can eradicate the stigma around abortion, we can eradicate the stigma around other family decisions, because at the core of how we talk about pregnancy decisions, there's abortion stigma at the bottom of it, right? It's like,
Right.
make a decision so you don't end up here, this worst place.
Mhm.
But if we're saying that that's okay, and all of these other things are okay, and we just show up with love and support of one another, we can change society. And so my hope is that people will open it up, even if they have an aversion or don't know much about abortion.
Right, right, because there definitely is a lot of stigma and things like that. Just from my earliest experiences of knowing about it was something negative, or you would see people out protesting and things like that. And then, of course, some of the things you talk about in your abortion splaining chapter about, just some of the things that aren't true that people will say as a reason to be against it. And then, of course, with us being in a Christian nation, everything that's
Right,
attached to that,
Christian.
you see,
Right.
that everything that's attached to that as well. So what I love about this book is that you really dive into the history so we can see from whence we have come. We can understand that, before time, in BC, folks were coming up with ways or figuring out ways to not have children. So just talk, we're not going to touch on everything, but just give us a little insight into what that looked like historically from indigenous communities as well as some of our African communities.
Yeah, there's sort of this way in which we talk about abortion as like it just started shortly before Roe v. Wade, or I don't know, it was only unsafe abortion starting like the 1800s. But Regina and I wanted to get really curious and think about what is the earliest abortion that we could find. And, there's been 6,500 years of abortion. There's abortions written down on Egyptian papyruses, ancient Chinese medicine. It's passed down oral traditions. And I think it's really critical to understand that this is something that humans have always seen as part of family planning, even though that wasn't really the term. It's just like there was this idea that if your menses were blocked, that your body was just not performing normally. And so you need to unblock your menses to bring you back to normal. And there were a number of teas that you could have. You could ingest different herbs. On the cover of the book, we have pennyroyal, Queen Anne's lace, birthwort, and peacock flower. Yeah. Just we wanted to get that in there as a cool quilted design as an homage to Black folks putting stories into quilts during slavery. But peacock flower in particular is one that grows throughout the Caribbean in Florida as well. But in the 1700s, there was a woman who wrote about it and published it and said that the enslaved people in Suriname were using it to cause abortions because they did not want their children to be enslaved.
Right.
And that was their way of liberating themselves. And so we wanted to be able to tell these stories that abortion has always been part of Black and brown people's liberation. Enslaved folks used to chew cotton root or even use turpentine to cause abortions. Indigenous folks used a lot of different plants like bear root or Queen Anne's lace. Again, things that your grandma would just give to you, your menses are blocked. Or in the case of, as we talk about in the book, the Crow tribe, they would have abortions if there wasn't enough food to go around. They were a very nomadic tribe. They just couldn't have other children. Like it was a common thing. But what's interesting with the Crow tribe is that when the United States government was putting them onto reservations and making it so that they did not have food rations, they could not be a nomadic tribe, they could not go follow the buffalo, they started experiencing malnutrition and having unhealthy pregnancies and having babies low birth weight, infant mortality. So they would have abortions because the pregnant folks were not healthy. And then the
Right.
US government was like, if you don't stop having abortions, we're going to take your land away because you're
Mm.
not having children. So it was wild that as they're taking their land away and making it so that they can't have healthy pregnancies, and then they have abortions, they then blame them for having abortions and say, we will take your land away and make you not have healthy
Yeah.
pregnancies. Gaslighting that the US government has done historically is quite wild. And I really think that it's important that people understand this is a deep history in this country and among all of our people. And also that people still use herbal remedies for abortion today, throughout Africa, throughout Central and South America, and here in the United States.
Right. One of the things that you mentioned that surprised me, like taking okra and using okra,
Yeah,
is
okra, I love that one.
I love okra.
I love that one.
But yeah, so I mean, there are just a lot of different things. As I mentioned to you before we came on, recently I've been thinking, I really would like to learn some things about mixing some teas and things like that, because I know that that's historically what we have done, and there are different medicinal properties in different teas, and also, it can be things to help expel a pregnancy, if that was what a person chose to do for whatever the reason. Because I think at the end of the day, it's a choice thing, as my grandmother used to say, and people have a right to choose what is going to work best for them, for their lives, for their families. Because one of the things that I have always found interesting about people's opinions about what people do with others do with their bodies is that, okay, you are telling this person or these people that you should have your children. It's wrong for you to not have these children. But then once the children are here, those same people aren't going to help you take care of them.
Right.
Those same people, like in the book, you talk a lot about Medicaid and some of the welfare systems. Those same people are going to do everything that they can to keep you from living off of the government.
Right. There's no support to have children. And I think that is where Regina and I, using the reproductive justice lens, want to have a different conversation about abortion. And it is that we actually believe everyone should be able to have access to the abortions that they want, but also to have children. And that as a society, how are we showing up for folks to make sure that they have what they need to raise children? I think I'll badly paraphrase a James Baldwin quote, but it's like, all children are my children. All children matter. And I think it's so important that we care about all of the children. And it is, the idea of being pro-life is, it's a really great grift, because especially when they're like, oh, we're pro-life, and Black babies matter in the womb. It's such a great grift because they can sit there and say that they care about Black children and advocate for Black fetuses, and never actually have to hear back from those fetuses about what it is that they need. They can ignore the entire body that fetus is in, shame that body that fetus is in, and then as soon as they are born, ignore everything that child needs. It's just such a great thing to advocate for, because it's a group like Black fetuses. You can advocate for them and they never talk back to you and they never ask you any questions, and you don't have to listen to them when they're born, or the actual person who's carrying them. It is really gross, though, the way that they denigrate Black women in particular through things like abortion is slavery, abortion is Black genocide. If abortion is slavery, then you're saying that Black people are the slave owners? Like, it's so gross, and it's so mean, and it's such deep misogynoir, just this deep hatred of Black women in particular. And I think that if we don't get to the bottom of this as a nation, we are going to keep being here as we have for a long time.
Mm-hmm. But yes, for men to impregnate women, expect women to have children, shame them if for some reason they don't choose to have the children. But then in many cases, not all, of course, we know, then don't stick around to be the support that they need to be for said children. Yes, that's
I mean,
not a good.
and this is where I think that we need to have a better conversation about talking about what does it take to be a parent in this country. And I think that a lot of people, there's obviously the monetary and physical resources that it takes. But also I think that we don't do a lot of education about that intergenerational healing and showing people what it is to be a parent. And I think people sometimes walk away because they are afraid that they're not going to be good at it, or because they don't have the money and the resources to be able to do it. And I think that if we can have some real conversations about parenting and family and do some deep healing, we'll be able to just have better support and communication and support for families across this country.
I lost your sound for a hot second. Are you?
Oh, can you hear me?
Hold on 1 second. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, wait a minute. That's me.
Okay.
I lost sound for a hot second, everybody. Sorry about that.
I also lost your
camera. 1 moment.
I think you're back.
I'm still here. Just give me 1 moment. You can hear me though, right?
Yes, I can. Awesome.
Okay, hold on. This happened before we came on.
Folks should put their questions in the chat.
One hot second. Apologize for that.
It's
but that is technology for you.
You know what?
Okay, I'm back.
Look, it's the day after the election.
Can everybody hear me okay?
Mm-hmm. It's the day after the election. We're doing the best we can.
One second. All right. We're good now?
I love it. Yes. Can you hear me?
Okay. I need you to say something because I can't hear you.
Can you hear me? I can't hear you. No. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Oh, no. Let's see.
Okay, lost volume.
Uh-oh.
I do apologize for that, everyone. Could you try to go out and come back?
Should I come out and come back? Okay. Okay.
Sorry about that, everyone. Technology does what it wants to do. Okay. Technology has a mind of its own today, everyone. So I do apologize for that. Waiting for Renee to come back so we can continue the conversation. Okay, so are we good now?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we're back. I don't know, something weird was going on. We had that happen before we came on, so forgive us for that, everyone. But one of the things I also do love that in the book, you talk about that there are a lot of situations that people could be in that may cause them to end up, making different choices in terms of whether to keep a pregnancy, terminate a pregnancy. And I think that so much, and this goes to some of the racial things that you were talking that, we've been talking about. So much it wants to center in saying, oh, it's these single Black mamas who are using abortion for birth control or whatever the case may be. And that's not true. But that is a lot of times we hear, but it's not true.
I mean, what I think is the question as to why people are concerned about what someone you like, if someone, how often somebody has an abortion. And also, like, I am one of those that, like, abortion is a form of birth control. Words mean things. It literally controls whether or not you have birth. Like,
Right.
it's fine. For a long time throughout history, it was birth control because the herbs didn't always work. And that's
Right.
okay. I think the question is where does this shame and stigma come from? And who does it exist to serve? And I think this idea that Black motherhood is sort of always the default of what not to do, or held up as the not this, that is the problem. That is the anti-Blackness. That is the misogynoir. And I think it's really important that people interrogate that
Right.
why is it that we look at single Black motherhood as this stain on society instead of actually seeing that this is a parent who is taking care of their children
Right.
and is a pillar of society
Right.
and is holding communities together, because we all know of mamas, Black mamas in our communities who cared for everybody's kids on the block, not just
Right.
their own.
Right.
And the way, like, we have to be clear about why these ideas exist. And part of it was because it was the excuse as to why they got any sort of like Medicaid and food stamp benefits, you know, in the early, like the mid 1900s, in 1950s, 1960s, as Black and brown people were saying we should be able to get access to these services. Originally, they were designed for white women whose husbands had died in war. Black and brown people said we should be able to have access to these services. And then as Black and brown people started enrolling in them, then it became, oh, welfare, oh, it's terrible. Medicaid, terrible. Food stamps, so bad. Who's on here? Enter Ronald Reagan. He runs his entire campaign on the welfare queen. Now, if we say welfare queen, you know exactly the conjured up image of who we're thinking about. And that's because he ran this entire campaign on that he was going to say government support is for certain people. And it is not these people, Black women, moms, single folks, like Black folks in general, right? And understanding that is how he used our reproduction to take resources away from children, families, food. This is somebody who's pro-life. That's wild. And that narrative continues to today, despite the fact that the majority of people who are on Medicaid or in food stamps are white. But they have this idea that the people who are undeserving of taxpayer dollars, which when you hear that, you should hear white people's money. The people who are undeserving of that are Black people because racism. Like, it's so...
Goes back to that racism, sexism.
Right. It's so important that people understand the way in which reproduction is so tied to anti-Blackness and misogyny and racism in this country. I mean, even when there was that Madison Square Gardens event that Donald Trump had, and that one comedian made the comment about Puerto Ricans and saying that, you know, Puerto Rico was just an island full of trash. That got a lot of comments and understanding about or talking about what he said, right? But what people didn't really understand is that he also made a comment about Latinos and Puerto Ricans like coming into this country that he said they never pull out. That's why they have a lot of children. And he's like, and that's what they do in this country. They never pull out, they never leave, right? That is so offensive on like 50 different levels. But the point of it is that you would think that for people who are pro-life should be happy that people are having children and not having abortions. But no, they're not, because at the end of the day, they're actually deeply concerned about maintaining services and power among white people and not sharing with brown people. And so they are deeply concerned about the reproduction of Black and brown people, to the point that it becomes this joke, a very racist joke about Latinos having too many children.
Right.
You never hear these jokes about all the TV shows that they had on TLC about white people having a ton of kids.
Right.
Because
The Waltons back in the day. I mean, I know that was a different time, but yeah.
Right.
Or even some of these reality shows.
Yeah, 19 and counting. We don't see that, right? Because that's
Right.
considered acceptable because of their whiteness. So it is really important that people understand how racism impacts how we see reproduction of different groups in this country.
And one thing that I can't help but think about in having, this conversation and in reading Liberating Abortion is the fact that it's like they're setting, the attempt is to set us up to fail, right?
Yeah.
Because
Yes.
it's like, okay, we really don't want you having a whole bunch of kids because we don't want to have to take care of those kids. They feel like they're going to have to take care of them with government assistance. So we make abortion illegal, understanding that there are some people who may still seek them. And then when they seek them, they use that as a way to potentially prosecute you because it's illegal.
Yep. It's there are these moments where I sort of feel like, I'm like, God, I sound like a conspiracy theorist. But when you recognize that under a capitalist system, you will always need an underclass of people who are doing the literal reproductive labor to build a class of people who cannot afford to be educated, are not offered education, therefore have to have low wage jobs and be able to just do the work. With that, in a nation like ours that spends so much money on criminalization and jails and all that, well, you also need people to be inside of those jails to pay for them. So then you need the police to monitor communities of color. So if people can't get jobs, then they might do jobs of survival that are then criminalized. And then they go into the jails. And then you have people who are profiting off of the jails. It sounds nuts. But then you actually look at the way our society is set up and you're like, oh, this is the truly the birth to prison pipeline. And it is just a very clear, they're funneling people in a certain way. And it's really sad. I don't think people assumed that reproduction would be tied up in this way, particularly with the criminalization of abortion and miscarriages and stillbirths, because they're criminalizing folks for everything.
Right, for everything.
But it is very real. And I think that until we have a conversation with people about it and help you understand, like see those connections, connecting the dots, then, it's going to be hard for people to understand. But once they can connect those dots, they can take action. They can say, oh, I need to be able to unlearn what I've been taught, because a lot of it is propaganda. And it's really scary because you truly, you start to see how it shows up in your own family and your own communities. Like, oh, I see how this person didn't get access to this education, and then they only could have this job. And then with that job, they didn't have access to healthcare. So therefore they didn't have access to birth control. Then they were forced to continue some pregnancies that they didn't want to. And then they couldn't afford to have those children. And it's just a constant cycle. But our hope is that we have a real conversation about what that looks like, and then how we can create a new system in which we take care of one another, no matter what pregnancy decision we make.
Right. Yes. Being able to take care of each other. That's another thing that you really tap into in the book. And you talk about some of the, of course, further back in history, but even like in the 60s and 70s, you
Mhm.
talk about some of the Black women who were involved in reproductive justice and some of the work that they did. So could you share a little bit about some of that? Because, I don't want anyone, I know this is just like an introduction to the book for those who haven't
Yeah.
read it, but I don't want anyone to walk away from this thinking that Black women did not play a significant role in making sure that Black women had choice.
Yeah, this was probably like my favorite part of the book and doing the research throughout. When Regina and I started writing the book, we had these ideas of like, we knew that our folks were there,
Right.
but they weren't in the books that we had read. And so we tried to figure out, how do we find them? How do we do the research? And one where we start in the opening of the book is we retell the story of Jane. And Jane was a group of women in Chicago who originally connected people who needed abortions to abortion providers, and then eventually learned how to do abortions themselves and did over 11,000 abortions in the years before Roe v. Wade legalized abortion nationally. And in the chapter where we retell the story of Jane, we tell it from the perspective of two members who were Black. They were Black women, and both had had abortions. One in particular, Sakina, had an abortion through Jane herself.
Hmm.
And it was really wonderful to be able to have always known that these, like, I don't know, abortion grandmothers existed, but also to
Mhm.
be able to tell their story, give them their flowers because they're both living, give them their flowers, and to be able to write them into history, into a history that had written them out. They were mentioned in the original book, The Story of Jane by Laura Kaplan, but in the retelling of Jane that people sort of did, in general, they were left out. And I think it's really important that we not only center them, but also tell the story in which they talked about how their activism within Jane and abortion care was deeply connected to the activism that they were doing with Malcolm X and the Panthers and Black liberation within Chicago. Another one that we really enjoyed looking at was the history of folks who were providing abortions in the 1800s and early 1900s. A lot of folks have heard of birth control activist Margaret Sanger, who did not provide abortions. She was just a birth control activist, and there's been a dozen books written about her for a lot of different reasons. Or they might have heard of Madame Restell, who was this really fabulous white woman who just had all the fanciest clothes, and she was an abortion provider in the mid 1800s, and she is quite a fascinating character. And where were the Black women? And we sort of had this issue of, when we were doing the research, it was like, all the women are white and all the men are Black, but some of us are brave. Where are the women of color? And so I went through on newspapers.com, did a bunch of searches for terms from the 1800s, like negress and botched abortion and Negro midwife, stuff like that, right? And was able to find like 20 different women who were arrested for providing abortions. We tell the story of two that we could find like multiple articles about and tell a real through line of the story in the book. One is Mildred Campbell. She was arrested like 5 times for providing abortions. She ran an inn here in Washington, D.C. that women would come stay at. And she was clearly very popular because even as she did have some women who died as a result of those abortions, which were later like second trimester abortions at the time, people still came back to her, and she was not prosecuted by the community, which would have been a jury of her peers, white men at the time. They did not put her in jail because they did not see what she did as a crime. Same thing, Virginia King, she also provided abortions. She eventually was arrested and jailed. But the fact that the community really rose up around her for many years when she was arrested, the first couple of times. So hers is a wild story because at one point, the house was burned down by the KKK and the newspapers went after her. And there was group like a highway robbery, all sorts of wild stories in there. And, you know, we wanted to tell these stories where they're not perfect people, but they are people who existed and they were doing this work. And I think it's important to honor them, give them their flowers, write them back into history, but also tell the truth that like they weren't angels and that's okay. They were just doing what they could to provide abortions at the time.
Right. And the thing is, one of the things that really stood out to me, you know, in all of this, in all of these stories that, well, quick sidebar, it's not always single women. There are married women who may seek abortions as well. So that's another thing that automatically
the majority of people have abortions already have children, and about half are partnered.
So that part. But then also just the fact that these women who were providing, you know, abortions and other forms of midwifery, all of these things, that they were providing a service. And that they were, yes, there were those instances where things may have gone wrong, but I mean, that's any time you're dealing with a medical procedure, something can go wrong. I mean, that's just life. But just the fact that they were helping people, they were keeping people out of situations that may have been dire for them, whether it is that, like you talked about with the Indian tribe, where they weren't able to care for the children. They knew they weren't going to be able to feed them. So by providing a service, they were actually helping someone. Or in the case where, you know, maybe in later years, a mother couldn't, you know, have more children because she already had 3 or 4 children. You know, they're helping people. And I think that that's some of what gets lost in all of this. The fact that the people who are making these choices, and the reason why they, you know, should have a right to make their own choices, is that what's helping me or what's helpful to me might not be helpful to the next person, but this is what's going to work for me and my family and my household and my life.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think it's truly about how do we make sure people have what they need to make the best decisions for themselves. And I think that if everyone, when faced with a pregnancy, knows that they are free to not continue that pregnancy, then they also know I actually am not being forced into continuing it as well. And I get to choose that. I get to step into that. And I think that allows us all to make freer, more honest and real, true decisions to what we actually want.
I do have to bring up one more thing, because believe it or not, we're almost at time. I knew the conversation was going to go fast, even with the little glitch we had for a couple of moments. But one thing you talk about, because some people, when you talk about abortion, people bring up adoption, and you do talk about that, you know, and how, you know, how they are not, you know, one is apples, one's oranges, they're not the same thing. So please talk about that a little bit. And then in terms of, like, when we talk about our community, how that looks in the Black community when you start talking about adoption.
Yeah, I want folks, when you see the book, you'll be able to get this little flow chart I made for you. But if you take a look at it, you'll notice that abortion and like adoption are not on the same in the flow chart, right? And I think what's important here, I'll show again, they're not in the same place, right? Because you either want to be pregnant or not. So if you don't want to be pregnant, you have an abortion. If you would like to stay pregnant, then you decide, do you want to parent that child? Yes or no? And so I think what people misunderstand, and it's by design by the anti-abortion movement, to have you think that the decision is between abortion and adoption, that you don't have to have abortion. You could just have it, like place a child for adoption. But when you actually do the research, and there's a fantastic book folks should read, it's called Relinquished by Dr. Gretchen Sisson. She did the research and she asked folks who placed their children for adoption. Generally, they were uninterested in abortion. They actually, what they wanted was they wanted to parent, but they did not have the resources and support to be able to do so. When you ask people who had abortions, did you consider adoption? They were wholly uninterested in adoption. They did not want to be pregnant.
Right.
The question is, do you want to be pregnant? Yes or no? And if it is a no, then you have an abortion. If it is a yes, then the next question is, do you want to parent that child? And for most people, the answer to that question is a yes. The reality for most people who then end up relinquishing their children through adoption is that they did not have the family support that they needed to be able to parent. They did not have the money that they needed to be able to parent. And so what people really misunderstand about adoption is that it exists because we don't have any of those social safety nets that we talked about earlier. Being able to have access to housing, food, healthcare. The more that we make those resources available, people are less forced into choosing adoption. I also think it's really important to have a conversation about adoption within Black and Brown communities, because we might engage in kinship adoption. So where someone takes care of a family, and that's just family, and that's just how we show up. That's taking care of a lot. Yes, that's taking care of family, right? That's a bit different. What I think is we also need to have a conversation about is that adoption, infant adoption, as Dr. Sisson's research shows, is essentially the transfer of infant children from low-income families to middle and upper income families, and often children of color to white families. And so they're losing their racial connection and they're losing their familial connection. So the question is that, at some point, maybe there will be people who choose adoption, right? But right now, a lot of people are forced into it because they simply can't afford to parent. And the more that we make resources for low-income parents available, the more they'll have the ability to parent. That is what, as we say in reproductive justice, the right to parent. They should be able to parent their own children, not lose access to their children simply because they don't have enough money. And the last thing I'll leave you with is that there was a story in Dr. Sisson's book that has always just sat with me. People should really read this book. It's so good. But one woman she interviewed said that she just needed $1,000. She felt like if I had $1,000, I think I could be able to parent. But she didn't have $1,000. And so she relinquished her child. So she lost the ability to parent her child. What people should know is that we have an adoption tax credit in this country, that adoptive parents get a tax credit of now $16,000 in a year. It would actually just cost us less to have given her that $1,000 to be able to parent her own child instead of a $16,000 tax break to a middle or upper class family that actually could afford a child and doesn't need the tax break. So financially it makes no sense, but also it's used as a divisive issue around abortion because most people don't understand the economic issues surrounding adoption and why people relinquish their children for adoption.
Yeah, so thank you. I just wanted to bring that up.
That's a good one to talk about.
Yes, because and also just in this book to understand that liberating abortion is truly about parenting and reproductive justice and a lot of other things. So, don't be afraid. Or you don't have to feel away thinking liberating abortion. What in the world is that? But I
Yes.
mean, there's so much more to it than just that one piece of reproductive justice. But the reality of it is that we are living in a time where people are taking away, our rights have been taken away in many places, and there
Right.
are situations where women are naturally passing a child through a miscarriage or whatever, and they need the additional assistance for the remainder of the fetus to exit the body. And that's where some of the problem is coming in as well, because they say, oh, well, that's considered an abortion and we're not going to do it. So like some of the cases we had recently with like Candy Miller and Amber Nicole Thurman, that is what happened. So it's deeper than just what you might
It's
think
about
it is.
all of us and all of our ability to decide if, when, and how to grow our families, and to be able to do so in safe and sustainable communities.
Yes, yes. So, Renee, thank you so much. I knew the people would probably be a little bit quiet.
I'm glad we had this conversation, and folks can reach out if they have questions. And I hope they read the book, because there's a lot in there. And
there's a lot. We could not talk about all of it. I'm just gonna, y'all see I have a whole bunch of tabs. So I'm telling y'all, there's a lot in here. And it behooves you, if you just want to learn more about women and our reproductive justice in general, about some of the ways that, like we took the T as one of the
I love that one.
abortion methods throughout history. We talk about what race and class has to do about it. Abortion splaining, which we talked about that a little bit. Our rights to parent. We talk about sexuality and pleasure, because I know sometimes we go a couple minutes over, so I apologize. But I do have to bring that up as well, just because of the fact that oftentimes, because of fear of pregnancy, there oftentimes women may not be able to really experience pleasure and sexuality and things like that. So I love that you talked about that in the book.
Yeah, and the way that we talk about sex, or even in the reproductive health movement, it's sort of all this preventive methods and all that, and we forget to talk about, like, it's okay to masturbate, it's okay to have fun, it's okay to like be in charge of your sexuality and like explore and figure out what it is that you like, and that it doesn't have to come from your partner, and you don't have to be afraid of like, oh, let me make sure I do this right so I don't get pregnant. It's okay. Abortion's there for you. And let's like talk about our bodies so that we can actually feel more comfortable in our bodies.
And understanding, a lot of us think we know what it means to get pregnant or what happens in the early stages of a pregnancy. I mean, all of these things. That's why I say this book is rich. It's almost 400 pages of information and history, and there's things what to expect when you're expecting an abortion. So something that talks people through that process of what to expect, how others can support those who might be choosing to have an abortion. So affirmations, I mean, there's just so much in here. So I definitely suggest that you pick up this book if you love women and birthing persons and want to be able to support them and just some of the things that they may be challenged with in terms of their reproductive systems and options. I definitely suggest you pick up this book. So Renee, thank you so much for being here. Again, as we said at the top of the show, at a time that we weren't going to anticipate that we would be here.
Wild.
It's wild, but this is just one of many issues that we need to make sure that we are informed about, so that we can speak intelligently, and so that we can figure out ways to continue to do the work, because we're gonna have to. We would have had to anyway, but we're really gonna have to now.
We gotta organize tomorrow.
Yes. Last question, I promise. We Testify. The work that you do with We Testify, just tell us a little bit about that for those who may want to get involved, not only read the book, but be able to get the work that you do through We Testify.
Yeah, we have a great team of folks who works with people who've had abortions to share their abortion stories. We have media trainings, closed space workshops, really helping people work through sort of all of the challenges or experiences or thoughts and feelings they have around their abortions, and what it means to share their stories and to change the conversation about abortion in this country. We want people who have abortions to be loved and seen and cared for. And so we do a lot of that culture change work, and just really create space for people who have abortions to meet up with one another and talk through all the things, share their stories, and grow a community, because it's 1 in 4 of us. It's very common, and it's important that we're seen and loved. So if you're interested, if you've had an abortion, even if you're not sure if you want to share your abortion story, check us out. We're at wetestify.org. And then you can find us on all the social media platforms. You can sign up for one of our trainings, one of our events, and we hope to see you.
Yes, thank you for sharing that. And again, Renee, thank you so much for being here. I don't know if you saw the comment or not, but we did have someone. Thank you for your work. So yes, and it is important work. And, I will continue to lift you up and all the things that you're doing, and continue to follow and just see what you're doing. And if you're ever back in Atlanta again and, need come and help. I'll be here, because one of the things I will say I am 58 years old, right? And so I've been voting for 40 years. I just realized that.
Yeah.
I have been voting for 40 years. So, I have gone through this presidential election thing basically 10 times.
Yeah.
And, but this is one of the first times where I actually feel like, okay, the fact that I went and voted is great, but I need to do a little more.
Yeah.
Because I have ways that I may be involved in community service and, stuff at church or whatever the case may be. But there are so many political issues that we need people like Renee, and that we can step in and help and support, and and go and stand with them if they're up, speaking to a committee or local legislators or whatever. We have a voice, and that voice goes beyond just our ability to vote. So this time, I'm really feeling very very positive about being able to do that going forward, in spite of the sadness and anger and frustration and all the things I'm feeling in this moment. I know that going forward, that this is something that we all need to do, and it may not be this issue, it might be something else, but there are a lot of things that we need to continue to stand up for, and don't just sit down and be quiet and let people run over us. That ain't gonna happen. Okay.
Yes, I love it. Get in where you fit in, whatever your issue is.
Get in where you fit in. And I said last question, I lied. I know that you are on a book tour. So are there any specific places where people can be on the lookout for you, and whether it's virtually or
I mean, we have a bunch of different cities coming up, and then a couple more into the new year. For the schedule, you can just go to liberatingabortion.org. Or also liberatingabortion.com. We bought all the URLs. And then they're, of course, on my social media. And at liberatingabortion.org, you can order the book from wherever your favorite bookstore is, or go to your local bookstore and see if they have it. And if they don't, just ask them to order it, and they'll get it for you. And they'll also get another copy for someone else. So you'll be doing yourself a favor and one for someone else. And I hope people will come see us out. We're doing a couple events in the Midwest. Like I'll be in Chicago next week, and Minneapolis the week after, and Boulder, Colorado, and I'll be at the Miami Book Festival as well. So check us out, and I hope to see people on the road. We're going to be on the road. We've got some events already booked for in January. So this is not going away, and I look forward to more conversations with people about the book.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, I'm going to let you grab some water because we've been chatting for a while. So I'll let you have a moment, and I'll just say good night to everyone else. So don't hang up yet, Renee.
Hey.
Thanks again. All right. Thank you to those who were watching live. And I know that people will watch after the fact, as always is the case. But I definitely do suggest, again, pick up a copy of the book because you are going to learn so much about reproductive justice, Black women's place within reproductive justice, and so much more, whether it be to have conversations with your daughters, as we talked about earlier, or your sons, or the men in your life. These are just important conversations to have because all of us have the potential to be impacted by pregnancy and things that happen after that. So thanks again for your time. Thanks for being here. As we've already said, go and pick up a copy of the book. And we look forward to seeing you again next week with another great and powerful conversation. So until then, take good care of yourselves, get the rest that you need, cry if you want to, whatever you need to do in the next few days, and then get ready to get back to work. So until the next time, take good care and continue to live well. All right. Bye-bye.